Hey everyone, welcome to the show today. Our guest today is Nick Tartaglia, author, entrepreneur, most recently author of Millennial Economics, which is a book we are going to discuss today. Nick, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Of course. Thank you to have me, Jeff.
So, this book, Millennial Economics, kind of heard about it out of the blue. One of the teammates on Voluntaryism In Action drew my attention to it. So, I gotta ask, I was
Yep.
wondering about this millennial economics. What does that mean? Is it like economics for millennials or
So the point was precisely exactly is kind of where you're going with it is the fact that I'm a millennial and we're in a new era, new millennial era. So my point was simply let's continue with that frame of thinking. Let's take it from a new generational point of view and let's look out into markets and let's try to understand what's in front of us because we're a generation that's about to incur a vast amount of problems around the world. So we need to kind of start understanding what's in front of us to take it head on rather than hide and run from it, which is usually worse.
Hmm, that's true. So kind of looking at economics from a new perspective, different lens than previously.
Correct. It's a continuity. It's not about ignoring what was done before us. It's about taking what was done in the past, the theory, the work, the Voltaire, the John Locke's, the Hayek, the Ludwig, the Thomas Sowell, the Milton, and continue their work. Those guys are not really producing any more work. We're in a new era now. So now you need to look to new generations to continue their work and continue to pass on the message, but not doing it just by spewing their work, by also producing work that continues off of what they've done to demonstrate they understand the theory, to demonstrate to others that they want to continue to evolve this. Because clearly their theory well, it's not that they haven't solved, it's more in the sense that it hasn't penetrated the market, their knowledge. So the issue is if we just let it stand as is, it may never penetrate. But if the next generation comes in and takes it and amplifies that information, that knowledge by producing their own work, maybe that's what's needed to kind of create a ripple effect to kind of extend their legacy into a new age.
Yeah, so not discarding the stuff from the past, but
Correct.
building upon it and continuing it.
Correct. That's how evolution is. Evolution is the foundation is taking from the past, learning from it, and stepping beyond where there's failure. The past, you can only understand the future by looking into the past. So you should never neglect history, never neglect past philosophers, economists, even if it's Marxist, even if it's in any school of thinking, you want to understand your enemies and you want to understand those you align with, because without that, you can never understand how to optimize the thinking of someone who doesn't align with your philosophy. You need to understand their gaps and then their way of thinking. And by doing so, you can kind of structure the parameters to kind of narrow them in or create a tunnel that kind of leads them to the enlightenment or, expanding their understanding of what is reality.
Now, it seems that you may have, I'm not sure if I didn't understand this correctly before, or if you kind of
Go ahead.
changed or redefined the term Homo economicus.
Hmm.
Because I'm not an economist, but what I
Go
had
ahead.
understood in the past was that the Homo economicus was kind of this model human who looks at everything perfectly rationally and makes perfectly rational decisions as a way of understanding the market in economic theory. But it
Hmm.
seems like you used it differently in the book. Can you talk about that?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's rooted basically in what often you will see in the Austrian school is people referring to statism. So the concept of Homo economicus, I think traditionally, and what used to be referred to, is a flawed definition because nothing is perfect. For that statement to hold true, it would be as if though God himself is playing as human beings. Nothing is perfect. You can never truly understand everything in front of you as a 100%. The only thing a human can do rationally and objectively is try to understand what's happening, contextualize it, and if there's a flaw, there's a mistake, or there's failure, you understand and you absorb those lessons and you apply it into future actions. So for me, it's a process being a Homo economicus. It's a process of understanding what's in front of you and how you can learn from those failures to optimize your future actions. But it cannot be a fixed state because I mean Keynesian, let's look at the current conditions of market where we apply what's Keynesian economic models. The flawed nature of them is the fact that we assume that humans are a fixed agent in the marketplace. Humans are not fixed, they're dynamic. So Homo economicus itself cannot be a fixed statement that you are perfect, because that would be saying that every single human being at that point in that model is a god. we're not gods. Therefore, we must assume a more dynamic approach to that term and apply it more logically to the fact that humans learn, grow. Same thing with markets. You want booms and busts. Humans have to grow, learn, make mistakes, and grow from that and from those errors. So therefore, Homo economicus for me, I evolved it a little bit to make it more applicable to what I think should be the definition of it, rather than how it's applied to these fixed models that obviously never predict anything in the marketplace and do a horrible job of contextualizing human nature.
Mhm. And one thing you wrote in the book, page 173, that I liked, being Homo economicus is an intellectual adaptation of consciousness from primal to collaborative. So looking at kind of contrasting the dog eat dog world, so to speak, with working together in a market economy instead of against each
Correct.
other.
Absolutely. It's the premise of what you guys are, right? Voluntarism in action. Voluntarism as an action is the
There you go.
foundation, is the fact that you are making a conscious decision to work with someone to elevate a collective prosperity. But it's not a zero-sum game where I'm going to come to you, take everything you have, increase my prosperity, but decrease yours in the process. It's a progressive progress that you're trying to apply to a collective. Therefore, you have to collaborate. So it's exactly what you're saying in the fact that you need to work together to fundamentally improve your conditions. So that is the basis of Homo economicus, because if he does not understand those conditions, then he'll never prosper. And if he does prosper, he's basically has to live as a beast, a primal organism. And that's how animals survive. And even within nature, animals still find their places to collaborate and find their places to be primal. The point is that if you're trying to produce a sustainable, prosperous society, then individuals within that society must themselves understand those very conditions and why it's necessary for them to be voluntary agents, because it's not just for the betterment of themselves, it's for those around them. And when you empower a culture to act this way, then you know that there's a sustainability component to that prosperity that can then be applied to those you love, your friends, your children, and their children. So it's very important to understand these duality in economics, that there is a primal component to the game you can play, and then there's a collaborative component. This is why we always say that free markets are about collaboration and voluntarism and all this stuff, because this is where collaboration thrives. Humans are social organisms. That's one of the most powerful tools we have as human species. The whole component of being a social organism is the fact you collaborate with others. That is one of the most powerful tools humans have. So why not take that powerful dynamic of human nature and amplify it and dissect it and understand how it actually applies to the game of economics?
That was one of the things that I liked about the book was how you turned it off, and like you just said, was the rules of the game. And another way that I like to think of it is the laws of economics. And when people understand them, then they can operate better. A parallel, like how we humans generally, not me specifically, understand more of the laws of science and physics. And because of that, we're able to create technology and other wonderful things that make our lives better. And if we can apply that same kind of thing by understanding the laws of economics instead of what you talked about in one of the chapter about the state, it seemed to me like what you were saying, the state is kind of a codified or enforced on the primal side, trying to force people and take from them instead of creating the collaboration according to those economic laws.
Well, because the state can only thrive if we don't collaborate. The smaller the individual, the less responsibility you take for yourself and to help those that are around you, the more the government thrives, because it siphons the economic energy from the marketplace, and then it itself allows itself to expand by taking responsibility for your living standard, for everything you need. But at that point, you become the slave because you've delegated that task to the state, and now you've lost all responsibility. The great I repeat it often in my book from Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. It's the same premise of free market capitalism. And I think it's the fact that people are so afraid of responsibility that they fear what they don't understand, which is free markets. And the beauty of it seems to be a scary thing, but it's a matter of embracing human nature. As Carl Jung says, we are our own greatest threat. The more we understand each other, the more we can kind of embrace our nature and amplify it.
One of the quotes that I liked from the book, I wanted to ask you about it because I think some people it kind of flies in the face of what we might term the common understanding of things. But he said on page 29 that an equitable and fair economic framework requires an effective and optimal market. I think that flies in the face of the common standard where they say, oh, in order to be equitable and fair, we have to have government intervention to force things to be equitable and fair, and the market just makes things unfair. So how does that work? Are we defining equitable and fair in different ways than typically are, or
Yeah, so typically when people say equitable, they're looking at like each person gets the same sliver of the pie. But equitable is in the sense as you produce what value is good for you. So whatever you put into it, you get. That's an equity, you know. So in capital markets, equity is what you put into it, whether it's sweat equity or capital equity, you get out of it what you put into it. So this is the same premise I'm going for. It's more from maybe from a financial lens, is that from an equitable I'm messing up the word. Equitable. How do you say it?
equitability?
Yeah, exactly. So the premise of that is the fact that you're getting out what you get out of it. So if you don't, and that's the nature of free markets, is you will reap the rewards out of what you get into it. And that is the beauty of it. It should not be somehow top down. It's a bottom up looking perspective to that statement.
Hmm. Okay. Along with that, another part that I liked, kind of turning the common understanding of freedom markets on its head, was about page 100, where you said that free markets permit morality to thrive, and that without that freedom, then there wouldn't be any morality, which again kind of flies in the face of the typical understanding where without the government forcing things and enforcing the law, it's just anarchy and chaos, and there's no morality anywhere. So what was that all about? Why does morality depend on free markets specifically?
So I'm not a religious person, but I will touch more to the religion philosophy. So let's look at Christianity, the Bible, for example. One of the most popular quotes that you see is teach a man to fish and he will feed himself for a lifetime. Give him a fish and now he becomes dependent on you. In the free market, if you delegate the task to the state now becomes responsible for everything. And there's no capacity for individual pursuit and individual thought. It's non-existent. The free market is the only mechanism whereby individuals can make decisions for themselves. Now, morality can only be established out of action because morality is not an idea. It's not a way of thinking. It's not a thought. It's how it applies in action. If I do good, it's because I did something to help somebody else. That was a moral action. If I think of doing something good, but I ended up slapping the person, it was an immoral act, even though my intentions are good. The state operates off intentions and not off of action. So we often get this confused by the actions of the state because we assume that the state is intentionally a moral entity, even though by observing its actions, everything it does is basically immoral. So we've kind of blurred the lines between what intention is versus what action is. And for me, morality exists only where action can exist. So therefore, human action is where we must observe. If you delegate the task to the state, then you have no capacity to make decisions for yourself. Therefore, you cannot be moral. You cannot tell me that by saying, I want you to force yourself on the marketplace to then take that money and then put it and give it to my neighbor who's poor, somehow you call yourself moral. You can't. What would be moral would be for you to say, I want to help my fellow man. Let me take a couple dollars. Let me go buy some food and bring a basket of food to my neighbor who's struggling. Now their morality thrives. But if I do that same principle, but I did it by delegating the task to the state, who has to force itself on others to then give a basket of good to someone else, all he's done was theft, stole, to then do a good deed. That's not how it works. Because in the marketplace, if an individual goes to the bank to rob to then feed his children, he's still liable. It's still an immoral action. But for some reason, for the state, that is not an immoral action. And this concept of democracy has blurred it because if the majority wants something to be done and does it, or at least does something good, but by forcing itself on others, somehow we've determined that to be a moral action. But I don't think so because the very primary input that we've put in for this outcome was actually immoral.
I think it's easier for humans to think of it that way when they're separated from it, when there's an intermediary like the government. One of my favorite quotes in the book is where you said something like democracy is outsourcing immorality.
Correct.
I love that. That was great.
It's true because it's like, okay, it's perfect. I didn't do it. Therefore, I'm a good human being because I simply stated that, oh, I voted for him to do what he needs to do. But in that process, he had to abuse and do what individuals themselves. If the premise like, okay, let's go with a democratic society. The premise is the individual is the most important component. If it's something and the state serves the people, if what's illegal for the individual is not illegal for the state, then how can the state be subservient to man? The state exists above man. Therefore, we are subservient to the state because he can change the conditions all he wants. And what applies to us from an immoral or moral standpoint or from a natural law doesn't apply to it, but it applies to us. There's a differential there that doesn't make sense. The
True.
state is an immoral entity that operates on the fact that we delegate all its tasks to it rather than taking it in control. And I think man thrives most when he does good for his neighbors because he understands the value of helping others. And by helping others, he reinforces a culture that reinforces itself and it becomes a sustainable culture that way. And I think that's one of the biggest issues is back to the economic ignorance is we don't seem to understand this. So we're doomed in these cycles of boom and busts because we've never permanently understood this. And once we do, my belief is that we can then permeate into through the culture and then reinforce it through education so that each generation could understand how to thrive and build off of the next generation rather than boom and bust and then one generation's envious as the other because they apply protectionism so they get angry and envious and then they steal from others and then there's this vicious cycle of envy and jealousy always.
Yeah, we've seen it even recently. I know you're in Canada, but down in the United States, we've seen with the Democrats and Republicans flip-flopping back
Correct.
and forth, and it always going back to the people as the actors and the voters. They don't vote based on what they think is going to be best for society. Not really. Even if they say that to themselves, they vote based on what they think they're going to get out of it, and if what
Correct.
they like is going to be enforced on other people. And like you said, it just perpetuates that cycle. But
Correct.
then the question becomes, how do we break out of that? You mentioned education specifically. What it seems to me that it would be very difficult while the government has such a stranglehold on education through public so-called government education. So what can be done about that?
So I think this is a millennial approach. Something that you didn't really see in the past is one, we have social media. Social media is a leverage tool that the past generations never could utilize. So the network effect of the past was non-existent. That's a variable that we can now actually bring into the mix and actually allow it to amplify the work we do. For example, me and you, we've never actually met in person, but without social media, this would have never happened. So I think that's one component. Social media, by better leveraging it and understanding the fact that it's a tool to be leveraged, that we could actually amplify the potential philosophy of what the philosophy that we believe in commonly. That's the first thing. The second thing is people are too afraid to open their mouth and speak on the subjects that they care about. And that fear allows them to be isolated in a corner where they never challenge anybody's ideas and nobody ever feels that external pressure. And a good idea thrives. If you let it loose, it thrives because it can take any other challenge head on. If you have a good idea, but you stay hidden in the corner, all those bad ideas that exist in the marketplace are never going to experience an external pressure to disrupt it and propagate to kind of elevate the understanding of what free market is or consciousness or economics. So education in the sense that we need to have dialogue and we need to bring it back to the streets. If we can't depend on the traditional means of academics and institutions to get to this philosophy and allow us to have these conversations, then through social media and through the network effect, people like myself and you can go out and have conversations, can propagate those conversations and information through social media and never be afraid to have those conversations because eventually you get to a boiling point where enough people actually finally have heard enough or have heard enough philosophy or finally contextualize it or met somebody or sees it on social media. There are more conferences now than in the past. So I think social media is one huge component and the fact that people need to stop being afraid of having these conversations because education is not just simply in the fact that you sit in a classroom and you teach. You can learn by watching TV, having conversation with friends, spending time with family, going out and just don't be afraid of a debate. people are too afraid of that. If the other person wants to walk away, then so be it. Let them walk away. But if you yourself always walk away from every single debate, then you've never created the pressure or the environment for someone else to potentially learn something, or for you to learn a new or way to articulate your point of view to better point them in the right direction. So this fear of conversing between individuals is also a huge gap in our educational curve, because we're all staying hidden in our corners rather than coming out on the battlefield and letting ideas clash.
So talking about it more, bringing it to, we might say, the cultural forefront, or at least part of the cultural consciousness. Because I think in the past, things like economics, how people buy and sell, haven't really been considered beyond simple slogans and platitudes.
Mhm.
So very interesting.
Correct. It's the Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I want to ask you about COVID,
Hmm.
as I know you live in Canada, and I went through Canada
Hmm.
during the COVID roundabout. It was 2020. Yeah. And we drove through, and it was not pleasant.
No.
Yeah, we had to have a special tag on our car. We had to go only on certain highways, only sleep in specific places. It it didn't feel good, let me tell you that.
Hmm.
And that was just passing through. So you have a chapter in the book that was dedicated to COVID and the effects that it had. Talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I always say when it comes to the COVID is that nothing is only negative. There's also a positive and a negative. So the COVID environment with what happened, I always say that it was one of the greatest learning curves of my life, because I got to witness rather than hypothetically assume a tyrannical state. I got to observe in real time, day to day, how they operated. And in the moment, I was able to contextualize and overlap it with historical behaviors of governments and states. So I was able to, in the moment, learn something that typically takes people decades or of reading books to try to finally understand it. I got to witness it in real time. And even in the past, even if you somewhat witnessed it, you didn't really get to see what they were doing on a major level, because you were very limited through the vehicles by which you could observe their action. Now you have social media, you have TV, you have news. It's all over the place. So I really got to observe and absorb information to an extent that I never thought I could. And by doing so, it also helped me by confining me in a space where I couldn't do anything. It kind of allowed me to write books and write stuff that I never thought I would do. So those are the blessings I give it. But then the bad stuff, this is where you realize, regardless of what the good it did for me, these are things that it should never have been done. So I live in Quebec, Montreal. The city is Montreal. It's the province of Quebec. The province is basically a state for those that are in the United States. And Quebec is a heavily old population, and they're also very French. So we live within a vacuum where a majority of the people here only listen to French communication. So anything outside of that bubble, they won't know. If you ended COVID 3 months before, or a year before, if on French news they're still telling you one thing, they're just going to go off of the French news because they have nothing else to go off of. So most of Quebec is elderly people that speak French. And as we know, COVID was heavily impacting old people. And there was a lot of disinformation, not from the marketplace, but more from the central institutions. So Quebec was in its own vacuum. It was one of the first places to shut down, first places to put masks, last place to kind of open up, last place to put masks. Here we had a curfew for about half a year at 8 p.m. So every day at 8 p.m., you had to be inside. You were not allowed to leave unless you had a permission slip and you were part of an essential business that was working during those late hours, and you had a slip from the business telling you work this was so if the police stopped you, which they had every right to stop you if you were on the street, and if you didn't have that slip, then you were punished. To what extent, I'm not entirely sure, but you were definitely penalized, even if it was financially. uh so I kind of spent almost 3 years dealing with this insanity in Canada, especially within Quebec. And what's sad is the federal government facilitated and supported it, and they implemented things like the vaccine passports, which is where you basically were part of a registry. And if you got vaccinated, it was implemented in a passport. And the only way to leave the country or enter the country or get on a train or get on a plane or get on a bus or go into a store or to a restaurant or to a gym was by having the passport. And they were putting it on the businesses themselves to enforce these things. So if the business itself didn't enforce it, the business as well could be penalized for allowing people that were unvaccinated in without a passport. So coming from someone that works, well, part of a lot of the part-time job I've done is in the restaurant industry. So I got to see a little
Mm-hmm.
bit of that impact on that industry because they had it hard. One time here they had let things go. There was no, they had shut down the restaurants, and this is coming November, December. We're about 2 weeks out from New Year's Eve, and a lot of there's a lot of parties in Montreal. Montreal is known for as a party city, so restaurants are buying all kinds of food, equipment, pre-selling tickets. Everybody's prepaying a week before New Year's Eve. All of a sudden, there's a new wave that they announced, which, like, as if you didn't know that was going to happen, when people have been talking about it for months prior. And all of a sudden, they decide to shut down New Year's Eve. Nobody's allowed to go out. All these businesses have spent all these thousands of dollars to get ready, stock up, prepay
Mm-hmm.
things, to then having to give it all back or give all the food to charities because all that food was going to go to waste.
Yeah.
Observing this stuff was something else. It was new to me, and I didn't appreciate it. And that's what really allowed me to go down a deep rabbit hole of studying economics and free markets and natural law. So I'm grateful for those lessons, but I'm not grateful for the fact that I observed something, my country, which I thought was a good country before all this, a place to live, until you realize the government will always reveal itself in the darkest of times, and it truly did.
So was that where your, shall we say, liberty journey started? Was about when
Correct.
COVID came and you saw, whoa, things are not what I thought they were.
I was always a rebellious person by nature. It was part of who I am, but it never had a political lens to it until COVID came around. When that came around, that's when I started understanding the political point or the political relevance to my independence and my sovereignty and my freedom. And that's when I had to really be, I forget who it is, but there's a quote that says, "A man who doesn't care about politics will have politics caring about them." And I truly saw the significance of that statement. And then I was like, okay, now I have to understand this game. Because there's no way a marketplace or a human being should be manipulated to this extent. And I knew how exaggerated the data was. I was following it on the government statistics from the beginning. Like, I saw the trends. I was like, I'm not afraid of this. I know my age. I know my health. I know my conditions. And it's a virus. Like, you're going to tell me all of a sudden that a virus operates different than traditional viruses. So nothing made sense. So in my mind, I was like, I'm just going to ignore this. The experts are not always right, especially government experts. So so that was really the moment where I said, okay, I need to go deeper into this understanding, because it's for my sake. If I don't do it for myself, then I'll never be able to take care of those around me as well.
I'm glad you did. And
Yeah,
we're all a little richer because you were able to do that. And looking at silver linings, like you said, I think that was one of the big ones of the COVID insanity, is that it woke up a lot of people to the nature of
correct.
the government. Some not as much as others, but I
Sadly.
think a lot of people became alienated from it.
Correct. Absolutely. A lot of my friends, it changed a lot of my friends, a lot of my network were changed by it in a positive way. It obviously ruined some relationships from me, some friends, but some of them truly understood what happened, and they allowed it to impact them in a positive way, in the sense that they understood that this will never happen again to them, that the next time it won't be the same thing. We
Mhm.
didn't know. For us, it was a learning curve the first time, but the next time something's gonna be different.
I think that ties back into what you said earlier about the methods of education being talking about things, because it seems like what the government and mainstream media wants to do is they want to say, well, we all did the best we could, and it was,
Correct.
we should all just forgive and forget and move on.
Correct.
But if we do that, then they're just going to do it again the next time something comes up. And when we have to keep it in the consciousness that, no, this was something they did to us and it was horrible. That when it costs twice as much to get food, you have to say, this is because of all of the stimulus during COVID. The government did this to us, and keep that out there. Otherwise, it's just going to keep happening again and again.
Correct. We can never let those mistakes or what they did become unwritten in history or hidden by history. If we don't keep talking about it, we don't keep it at the forefront, we don't keep calling it out, and we don't hold them liable and responsible for these things, then history, and it's usually history is written by the winners, not by the losers, then they win. And then history's written their way. And then it's all driven up by intention. And then people forget that the causality is actually individuals rather than just some miraculous virus of nature. A virus itself has no arms, has no army, has no weapons, has no capacity to tell you to sit inside your house and stay. Only the state, through its arms of enforcement, can force you to stay inside. The causality of my suffering was not a virus. It was the state's actions in the face of a virus. And we blurred these lines of causality. Has been delegated to or scapegoated to, oh, the virus caused everything. Oh, we didn't know that. Or they're using intention and emotions to blur the lines of reality, because everybody loves a good story. Everybody loves to be swayed by their feelings or the emotions, because nobody uses a logic and objectivity to say these people are not here for our good being. They're here to just take power and do what is in their best interests. And the central institutions will always protect themselves, even at the cost of the marketplace.
Especially simple stories people love. But you're absolutely right. The virus, some people died because of the virus, and that was very
Correct.
sad. The virus did not shut down society or
Correct.
jack up inflation. So,
Correct. Exactly. And that's where the people need to understand, is back to education. It's causality. People need to understand correlation, causality. Your economic parameters can only be limited by some sort of natural force. Yes, a tsunami, a tornado, you're limited, so be it. But a virus that we slightly understood, it had no capacity to prevent me from stepping out my house. Therefore, it is not a causality. The only causality was other humans pretending to be my God, telling me that you cannot leave your house. And if you do, you will be punished. I mean, I tell this to religious people all the time. I go, your first principle, your first commandment is, there is no God but God. You bend your knee to no other man but God. The moment the state shut you down and told you to stay inside, you bent your knee to an idol. You bent your knee to a false idol, and you have deviated from the first principle of your belief. You broke your
especially
first
when
commandment.
especially when the state told you couldn't go to church.
Couldn't go to
You had to
church, couldn't
stay.
see your family, couldn't be with loved ones. Like, you allowed the state to become your God. You literally broke the first commandment of your religion. And the West is supposed to be a heavily religious, Christians and Jews and Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, even Muslims, the same thing. Regardless of the religion, you don't bend your knee to a man. It goes back to the classical liberalism. It goes back to the Enlightenment period. It goes back to the Magna Carta. No man is above me but God. If you believe in God, I'm more about nature. Some can argue that nature is created by God, so be it. There's no disalignment there. It aligns. It's a matter of causality. I don't necessarily know what goes beyond nature. That's where you can play the ambiguity of God. So be it. Cannot disrespect that. But nature creates certain conditions, and I bend to it only, no man.
Would you say that kind of getting those conditions, the parameters of the economic game, as you call it, getting those in front of people and creating a conversation about them was the main purpose of the book, Millennial Economics?
Yeah, absolutely. My point was, I spent, like, on my social media, on my platforms, I post a lot, I criticize a lot, I try to dissect a lot of information. But a part of me was saying, if you're so philosophically curious about the way things are and you always going to point out problems, why not also try to create sort of framework solution to kind of apply as a template for other point of views, to kind of help people's perspective of the market shift and be able to see where they're going and what's ahead of them. So I said to myself, become part of the solution, try to continue the work of those before you. I had the time, I was locked down, couldn't leave. So in my mind, I was like, you know what? Let me use these 2-3 years to go down an intellectual journey and try to produce work and try to better the work of those before me and actually be part of the solution rather than just complain and cry about what's happening to me. So I definitely wanted to kind of make it an educational tool and add to the pool of problem solving rather than just be a variable that talked about it but never actually added to the mix.
Nick, where can people find more of your work?
So you can find me on my regular Instagram page, Nick would just see no K, Tartagli. So at Nick Tartaglia. We also have, well, me and myself and my partner, we have a podcast called New Gen Mindset. The focus is wealth and sovereignty. So if you like capital markets, if you like investing, if you like philosophy, entrepreneurship, understanding the world around you, we have economists, traders, entrepreneurs, CEOs, former economic advisors to politicians, with the premise of really trying to understand the world and how to be sovereign. Allocating money and investing your money is part of that sovereignty, because if you don't understand how to control your capital, then you're susceptible to whatever the state does financially to you. So a huge component of sovereignty is understanding your financial position and how to allocate your own capital. That's a huge component of our platform. So Instagram there, YouTube with the podcast, or it's on Instagram as well. And then on Twitter as well, but that's what macro_Imperium Mind. So those are the platforms you can find me, and LinkedIn if you have LinkedIn.
Fantastic. We'll get those down in the description of the video. Again, Millennial Economics is the book. Nick, thank you so much for coming on today.
Of course, I appreciate it. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you so much for tuning into the show today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and head over to our website. You can check out our latest charity campaigns. Bye-bye.